now, Rishi Sunak has been warned that UK risks breaching international law by continuing to sell arms to Israel. 3 former Supreme Court justices are among more than 600 legal experts who've signed a letter to the Prime Minister saying exports must end. Now, the letter warns that the present situation in Gaza is catastrophic and there's plausible risk of genocide, and that the UK government is legally obliged to act in preventing it. Meanwhile, the world's central kitchen has called for an independent investigation into the Israeli strike that killed 7 of their aid workers, including 3 British nationals, on Monday. The charity's founder has accused the Israeli military of targeting the convoy they were travelling in systematically, car by car. Now, that's a claim Israel has rejected as nonsense. Joining me now here in the studio is James Schneider, a former aide to Jeremy Corbyn, and down the line, delighted to be joined by Dr. Yaniv Voller, a senior lecturer in Middle East politics at the University of Kent. Gentlemen, very warm welcome to both of you. Dr. Voller, if I can start with you. The voices are getting much louder, particularly here in the UK, calling for the British government to stop selling arms to Israel. Do you think those voices will be received in Westminster? What do you think the reaction will be?
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, I think that the pressure on the British government is growing. Now, we do have to realize that the trade between Britain and Israel is not massive. So even if the UK decides not to sell arms to Israel, it will not have a major impact on the Israeli government and the IDF's ability to fight in Gaza. But this will have a symbolic significance given the very close relations between the UK government and Israel.
So give us some context. You said that we don't sell a huge amount of arms to Israel. What sort of numbers are we talking about, and what countries sell more than us?
So most of the information is classified, and I don't really have access to the figures. But the major supplier to Israel, of course, is the US. And as long as the US keeps selling weapons to Israel, this will have the most significant impact on the IDF's capability of fighting in Gaza. So again, the levels of trade, the levels of security trade between the UK and Israel are not great, but this will have implications. Even the calls to the UK government to stop selling arms to Israel have already made these calls have already made a significant impact on Israeli public opinion and global public opinion.
All right, let me bring James in here. James, we've had these hundreds of leading legal figures calling on the government to stop selling arms. We've also had a number of Conservative members of Parliament and former ministers doing the same. We've had Jack Straw, a former Home Secretary, Labour Home Secretary, saying the same. It feels like this is that politically this is building up a head of steam.
It is. I mean, of course, it should have been done this months and months ago. The crimes that have been committed, the great breaches of international law have been carrying on now for 6 months. It's the aid workers who were killed by Israeli bombing join around 200 other aid workers who have been killed in the bombardment over the last 6 months. Over 100 journalists have been killed, not to mention the tens of thousands of civilians, many of them children. But I think for a lot of the political class, the fact that it's British bombs and British bullets that are not only complicit in these grave crimes, these crimes which could plausibly amount to genocide according to the world's highest court, but that it could be British bombs that are killing British citizens in this conflict that has tipped things over the edge, and I hope it does. Now, Britain does not export a huge amount, but I think it's the 3rd largest exporter of arms to Israel, about £500 million worth in export licenses over the last decade. And Britain pulling away from Israel is diplomatically significant. Israel is becoming more and more isolated in this war because it is a war of great destruction that the vast majority of countries on earth and the vast majority of the people, even in the countries that have been supporting Israel, are opposed to.
Yes, it's interesting. I think we're the third largest European seller. I think the Germans and the Italians sell more than us. And of course, as both you and Dr. Voller have said, the amount of American arms that are sold to Israel dwarfs what any Germans, Italians, or Brits are selling. But Dr. Voller, let me come back to you, because we're not only getting calls for arms sales to be halted, licenses to be revoked, if you like, to Israel from the UK, but we're also getting calls from people wanting to see the legal advice that the government has been getting about the legality or illegality of what is going on in Gaza. Explain that situation.
So I think that much of the discussion in the UK has been inspired by the discussion in the International Court of Justice. Not much, in reality, not much has actually changed in the last few months, in the sense that most of the killings actually happened in the first months of the fighting. The number of casualties since the beginning of the year has declined dramatically. So there hasn't been a major change in terms of the targeting of Gazan civilians. I think that what did drive the debate in the UK is actually the death of the aid workers of the World Central Kitchen. And there's something about the fact that it's only when it comes to foreign nationals and aid workers that are being killed in Gaza that the discussion really comes up, and this has much to do with this event.
Well, James, talk to me a little bit about the Labour Party. Obviously, you've stated your opinion that you think that these arms sales should be halted immediately, these licences. It's interesting to me that so far the Conservative politicians have been more vocal on this issue than the Labour parties.
Well, that's because the Labour Party is performing its traditional role in foreign policy, which is to tuck in behind the government, which in turn tucks in behind what the US is doing, and not to set out an independent path.
So the government's getting more opposition from the backbenchers behind it than from the opposite bench?
Of course, it's getting some from the benches opposite, but basically from backbenchers, not from Keir Starmer, who is trying to tread basically the same line as David Cameron. Now, the reason why David Cameron has slightly more political space within the establishment to be slightly more vocal as he has been than Keir Starmer over the previous months is because of the perceived greater closeness to Washington. But this is really, it's a travesty. It shows you the narrowness of our political system when the overwhelming majority of people have wanted a ceasefire for months, have wanted the suspension of arms sales, have not wanted Britain to be complicit, because that is what we are. Our bombs and our bullets and our diplomatic cover are aiding the crimes against the Palestinians.
Well, it's interesting when you say overwhelming number of people. I think overwhelming number of people hate to see the death and destruction. Of course, any human being hates to see that. But equally, the atrocities committed by Hamas were so appalling, were so repugnant, that people were willing to see our government giving full support to Israel to defend themselves.
Well, if you look at the polling very early on in the conflict, you had the vast majority, something like 78%, according to the first YouGov poll, in favour of a ceasefire. The majority of the public are in favour of stopping arms to Israel and have been in polling for some months now. So, yes, of course, there was horror at the images that were seen on October 7th. But for most people, they can see that on every day since October the 7th, for the people in Gaza, they have been experiencing the same thing. And it doesn't end when the attack ends, because now there is famine. Now Gaza has, as Benjamin Netanyahu promised on the 8th of October, has been razed to rubble. It has no health infrastructure. It's had most of its buildings destroyed and an entire generation scarred terribly, both physically and mentally. So for them, this war of destruction that has been waged against them has been going on for decades and is going on for much longer.
Dr. Voller, let me bring you back in here. James paints a very vivid picture of the situation, which most of us are more than familiar with, and a lot of people are getting increasingly horrified about. And as you said, this attack on the aid workers, the 6 foreign nationals and the Palestinian driver, has brought into sharp contrast or sharp focus for a lot of the international community the situation, wanting to put pressure on the Israelis. But actually, what do you think will happen next?
That's a really good question. So as I said, the level of fighting in the Gaza Strip itself has actually waned. For the time being, the IDF only has about 4 battalions in Gaza. We did witness some clashes around the Al-Shifa hospital, but in reality, in most parts of Gaza, the fighting there's not much fighting taking place. On the other hand, there are still tens of hostages in Gaza. And the Israeli government cannot declare the end of fighting or the transition to a new stage of fighting without these hostages returning to Israel. So the only leverage that Israel has over Hamas is to continue the fighting, right? At least on paper. And there are negotiations taking place, of course, with the mediation of Qatar and the US and Egypt. And it seems as if, and although both sides have not yet really declared their willingness to reach some agreement, without reaching this agreement, the Israeli government will not have a mandate to stop the fighting. So my assumption, if I can try and predict what's going to take place in the short term, is that Israel and Hamas will eventually reach some agreement with regard to the release of some hostages, which will result in further decline in the fighting.